Tom has written, directed, and performed in more than 200 plays worldwide. Last summer, Sweetwater Taste was his 15th Horizon collaboration. He's been with us every summer since 2003 with our first play, Two Queens, One Castle. I remember I had known Tom a long time, and after he closed Jomandi, or he finished with Jomandi in 2000, I lost track of him, and then I was looking for plays to consider, and I was looking in Minneapolis, and this play came up, Two Queens, One Castle, that had gotten a lot of raves and awards, and it said director Tom Jones. I went, what? What's Tom doing up in Minneapolis? And so I called him up, and we ended up producing a production of that here. And then he's been with us every summer since then, doing plays that he's either written, directed, acted in, all three, two of those, every summer a different project. Other things that he's done with us are Shed-In, that he wrote and acted in and directed and wrote, Cool Drink of Water, which he wrote and directed, Three Sisters and Two Queens, One Castle, and Blackberry Days, which he wrote and directed. And then things that he directed include Every Tongue Confess, The Kink in My Hair, How Black Mothers Say I Love You, The Bluest Eye, and many, many more. I'm going to take this moment to, as I said, he's co-founder of Jomandi Productions. He lived in Atlanta for a long time. I'll let him tell you his beginning story. And since then, he's working all over the country. He works in DC, Las Vegas, New York, internationally, on television, and he's won a bunch of awards, Helen Hayes Awards, Adolfo Awards, worked in San Diego, and most recently in Atlanta. Besides Horizon, we recently just started getting other jobs in Atlanta. It was just us for a long time in Atlanta, but he did Five Guys Named Mo, Theatrical Outfit last year, and Hands of Color at Synchronicity Theater. So we're getting him branching out to other places in Atlanta. But I'm going to let Amy play a little clip of his work so while we're getting him up and going. This is from Blackberry Days, which was a huge, gigantic hit for us a couple years ago. And Ruth Watson was his co-writer on that production. And so, and Renee Clark, the music director. So we're gonna let you see, this is one of the dance breaks. And he is a highly movement-centered director. So this is his work creating this dance break from the show.
Oh, yeah. What's that now? Oh, you look at me. I'm looking at you. Hey. Oh. Hey. Here we go.
We just watched a clip from your dance break from Blackberry Days. You got to take your, Tom, put your, there you go.
Am I back?
You're back, yeah.
I needed the skill of a 15-year-old genius. I had to go get wiser, bigger minds than me, people above my pay grade to make this happen.
Who's there helping you?
Raquel's son, Gambier. You know, reminds me of Angie. It's like, Angie, help me. I don't know. Get me onto Facebook, Angie. I don't know. I have
Tom has a wonderful daughter, and we are getting, and she's graduated now from NYU and going to Yale School of Drama. We're getting ready next week. In 1 week, we do our New South Young Playwrights Festival. And I'm proud to say that Angie was part of our festival one year and then came back and said, Dad, I think I want to be a playwright. So
That's exactly where it started. Yeah, it was that playwriting program is a boot camp. It's like, what is it, a week, 2 weeks, 10
yeah,
days? It's
like
really cool.
all day,
But
all
they start at 8 in the morning and go to 11 at night. And I was like, well, either she's going to fall in love with theater or she's going to say, you know what, this is just too much work. I don't need to do something else with my life. But she fell in love with it. And that kind of kicked her off. So she's been writing ever since.
We have a lot of people. We've got a much larger crowd now. People are growing into our group here that are with us, and we have people that are monitoring our feed. So we got to see a little bit of your work on Blackberry Days. But I thought I would just start out by asking you to tell a little bit about, how did you get into theater? How did you end up in Atlanta? Just your kind of background of who you are. We do have these sneak peeks for every show, but we never have time to really delve into, how Jomandi got started and all those kind of things. I knew you as a Jomandi artistic director,
Right.
full of yourself, full of piss and vinegar, they say back in the day. But with so much,
a little puffed up. There was nothing wrong with the ego. The ego was not having a challenge. It was.
You know what? You can't. I don't know if you can actually start a theater and run it and keep it going without a little of that. You know what I mean?
I think you do. You have to have a little yeast in the id and the ego to keep it going. I actually went to school. I was born and raised in New York, and I actually went to school to be a lawyer. That I'd always been
that too.
Huh? Yeah. I had always been writing, and in high school, and was always in love with writing. And but went to school, Amherst College up in New England, and I thought I was going to be a lawyer, and was on that path for a couple of years. My writing mentor, Sonia Sanchez, I took a class from her and realized that I was being more drawn to the art than I was to the political science. Then there was a young woman who was also in the acting program, who was a dramatic arts major, who ended up being the blind girl in Lionel Richie's Hello video, right? We were classmates, and she stumbled into an acting class, and having a crush, I stumbled into an acting class with her, forgot about her, and fell in love with acting and theater. And then at that point, changed majors. I also did a brief stint at University of Chicago as an exchange student, and went to see the old Kumba workshop, which was like infamous back in the day.
What was the name? I don't think I know that.
Kumba, it's Kuumba.
Kumba workshop, yeah.
Kumba workshop. Val Gray Ward was its founder and artistic director. And went to see a show that I think was a Leroy Jones, Amity Baraka play that they were doing. And a guy I went to high school hadn't seen him in 2 years, was the lead. And I was just, at some point, I just had an epiphany sitting there watching him saying, wow, I need to do this. So we, talked for a while and talked how we got into it. And he started talking about his whole relationship with it. I went back to Amherst as a junior.
Now, was Kumba at U of C? Were they connected to U of C some way, or they were just?
No, they were just part of the Chicago theater community. And he was at Northwestern, actually, in Evanston, and he was always been interested in theater, so he just ended up auditioning, just as a student. Went back to Amherst and changed my major, and then in my senior year, my father was diagnosed with lung cancer that had metastasized to the liver. He was terminally ill. Left school to help take care of him with my sisters and my mother. Went back to school. He died December 20th, 1977. I graduated then in June of 78. But his fight for mortality became the basis of a play that I had written as a senior thesis in Amherst called Every Father's Child. And in fact, Marcia played the lead. Marcia Jackson, who was the co-artistic director of Jomandi, played the lead there because she was at school at Smith. We then, after I graduated, used that piece to endow a scholarship fund in my father's name at the School of Medicine at Morehouse, because he was really very instrumental with Lewis Sullivan and a bunch of other people getting that off the ground. My father had moved from New York to.
Your dad, was your dad in Atlanta at the time?
He had moved to Atlanta 2 years prior. He was the deputy commissioner of health for Fulton County. And that's what brought him into Atlanta. And that's what brought my sister had come to Atlanta in the early 70s. My other sister followed. And then my father and my mother came down probably a couple of years after that. And I think it was 75, 76. And again, he'd been here 2 years. So that was why we ended up so we needed a name and actuality to produce this thing. Because I was getting ready to go to Villanova in the fall. Marsha was going to Rutgers. I was going to go to Villanova to get my master's. And we needed this thing, this producing vehicle. So my mother and I were sitting in the house, and she's at the kitchen. We're trying to figure out, okay, what's the production company is going to, what are we going to call it? So we came up, Amanda. We started playing with the initials of all the people in my family. So we finally came up with Jomandi. J-O was for Jones, our last name. M-A was for Ma, my mother. A-N was for Andrea, my sister. And D-I was for Diana, my other sister. And when we kept saying it was kind of like the rain in Spain falls mainly on the plain. Oh, that's right. It feels right. Jomandi. And so there we are in the kitchen. Jomandi. She's saying, Jomandi. That's nice. That is nice. Jomandi. So we settled on Jomandi being the name. Fast forward a year, Marsha and I go back to school, get disenchanted with getting a master's, come back to Atlanta to start Jomandi, full time and deal with this theater thing, because we've gotten, this sense of what a theater felt like working for.
That was a big decision to leave grad school. So you guys went to grad school and then left?
And left.
That's a decision. Wow.
I think it was the whole experience of working on Every Father's Child in the summer and working in a community and in a kind of more professional environment that said, I think we were hungry to actually start doing theater. And going back into school just felt like 2 to 3 more years. Do I want to make this investment? And I think we were kind of really highly charged by and incentivized by having performed this thing in the summer of 78 and it being very successful in us endowing the scholarship and feeling like, wow, we have something here, let's continue. Do we want to wait 3 years, kind of put it on hiatus for 3 years and come back to it? And I think we both kind of had the same revelation at the same time. So came back to Atlanta to actually start. And was a year later, we started working at a place called the Old Neighborhood Arts Center, where we bartered teaching classes for rehearsal space. And, that began the genesis of trying to create work. And we were pretty much a gypsy theater company. But a year later, watching this National Dance Company of Senegal, and it was at the old Civic Center in Atlanta. And there's a reception afterwards, and I'm sitting there talking to one of the artistic directors of the company. And she says, oh, what do you do? And I said, oh, well, I run a small theater company here in Atlanta called Jomandi. She said, oh, Jomandi. I said, oh, you've heard of it? She said, no, in Senegal, in one of the dialects, it means people gathered together in celebration.
What? No.
At that point, I was like,
you never told me that. Oh, yes. Wow.
And at that point, we all went, oh, wow. And that actually for years became our mantra. People we had, and the family is now, but people gathered together in celebration. It came from one of the Senegalese dialects. That's what it means. And it was like, wow, okay, this is fate. This must be what we should be doing. So yeah, that's the genesis of getting into the theater in Atlanta. And that's why it's always been very much family connected. The first board of directors were my 2 sisters and my mother, and we slowly, as we developed over the course of the years, added cousins and, literally our first business manager, Cliff Barber, who was later, married our first production manager, which was Debbie, at that point, Debbie Birdsong and Debbie Barber, who is now the artistic director of YEA, Youth Ensemble of Atlanta. But they met while we were, and then they got married, and it really became kind of very familial. And so we started talking about and referring to Jomandi as family and extended family, and people feeling like they were a part of a family. And in those days, we couldn't really pay a lot of money. So what we would do was do this annual stipend at the end of the year, where we would pay, because we were using the same actors over and over again. So we would give them this kind of larger honorarium and throw this big party for them at the end of the year. Which later on became our Juneteenth celebration, which later on we started doing for subscribers, et cetera. So everything was kind of organic. All of the programming was an outgrowth of this kind of idea of rooting a theater in a community, and also that the community is your extended family. And so that's what the early days.
And where did you start in terms of your building facility? You know, where were you at when you began? I know that you ended up in 14th Street Playhouse at the end, but I don't know where you
The
were.
very first production we did was at Martin Luther King Jr. Middle School Amphitheater. What
Hmm.
was now I think on, it's Ralph Abernathy, but then it was called Georgia Avenue, right near the stadium. That was the very first place set. And then we went to the Neighborhood Arts Center, which is
Where
on,
was it? I don't even know where
it was
neighborhood.
on Georgia Avenue, Foremost Avenue. It was part of that whole theater program in the 70s, 80s, which
Oh,
began to take schools, you know, and reconvert them into arts centers.
yeah.
So I think, you know, I think the same thing with the facility that you're in was part of that. The Center for Puppetry Arts was part of it. They took about 5 or 6 of
Is
those,
it still around? Is it still,
but
I mean, neighborhood arts
it
center?
burned. It burned to the
Burned.
ground.
Oh,
And
okay.
so now what you there's just like a little park that you see. But that was where we first did, you know, and it was kind of infamous. It had the Romare Bearden Gallery. So Romare Bearden came in. This is where Spike Lee, Sam Jackson, and LaTanya Richardson used to teach classes there. Spike cast one of his first one of his films there. You know, I think LaTanya Richardson, Sam Jackson taught acting. Samuel L. Jackson taught acting classes there. Jim Alexander, noted photographer around town, you know, had his studio there. So it really was this interesting trafficking of lots of different artists that, and when you came into Atlanta, if you were Black, Walter Dallas, who recently passed, who ran Proposition Theater Company, who just passed a couple of, you know, years ago, who left here and then went to New York and also Philadelphia and dealt with Freedom Theater. His company started out of there before it went to the Alliance, and then before he then went on in, you know, further north. So it was really kind of this breeding ground for a lot of and a lot of artistic synergy of different arts that were there, because it really was an art center. So it had a visual component, it had a photography component, it had a performing component, it had a dance component. The African Dance Ensemble was there for years. Barbara Sullivan used to do, you know, so it was really an interesting kind of, and it was a place where if you went to, you could meet other artists and begin to, you know, create a relationship. And so that was kind of our first home. It was where we, after Martin Luther King Middle School, we went there, then we went back to Martin Luther King Middle School. We then went to a theater called the Billie Holiday Theater, which was a theater at Underground Atlanta.
Oh, right. Yeah.
And we did about maybe 6-7 months, and we're trying to really, it was an old, I think an old small independent movie house. And they were creating it as a theater, and we went in, we started doing that, and it had a roller rink on top of the theater. So you'd be doing a play, and you would hear you die, you'd hear the bass would start, and you feel the roll. So we had to kind of program right at the moment that you know, not too late when people would come out, but that it wasn't quite at rush hour for the roller rink. We then moved from there. I'm trying to think where we went after Bill Holiday. Then we went to OIC, which was also in that area. It's still there. It was OIC. It was right on Pryor. And if you came down 75, 85 and you took the first exit, it was right down the street from the stadium, from what was then Atlanta Fulton County Stadium where the Braves played. Yeah. And we were there for probably 3 or 4 years. And then we created a relationship, struck up a relationship with the old Academy Theater. But Frank Widow, we used to all do something every year called the Atlanta New Plays Project, which was a wonderful kind of coalition of theaters that came together once a year to present new work. And it was a way of encouraging new work. And so we had always had a fairly healthy relationship with Frank and the Academy. And at some point in time, and Frank was really kind of legendary because he was the first one to ever have an integrated company in Atlanta. And that was part of his mission, where he came out of the service in the mid-50s, and then came to Atlanta. And when he started his company, at that point, there was the big three. There was the Theater of the Stars with Chris Manos. There was the Academy Theater with Frank Widow. And Nancy Hager was the managing director.
Oh, I forgot about Nancy. Right.
And then there was a Center for Puppetry Arts, and those the Alliance, the Academy, Center for Puppetry Arts, and the Academy. Then it was kind of like the big four, and we then struck up a relationship with the Academy. And somewhere in the mid '80s, they said, "Would you like to, become a resident company at our theater?" And we were like, "Yeah, we would love to." And so they then hosted us for a couple of years. When they the corridor on 10th Street, which is where they were located, 10th and Peachtree, started to be redesigned, and Bell South wanted to have their corporate headquarters there. There was this public-private partnership that was struck where they built a theater, which is now the 14th Street, which was then the 14th.
Now it's SCAD Show.
It's SCAD Show, but
don't get me started on that one.
You and me, you and I both. Yeah, it's every time I pass, I have a little tinge. But at that point, it was being built for the Academy Theater.
Yeah.
And it became the Academy Theater, and they were on 14th Street, and that's where we were. And we had been working with a lot of artists that were already part of, that Kenny Leon came out of the Academy Theater, Carol Mitchell Leon came out of the Academy Theater, Chris Kaiser. You and Jeff came out of the, exactly. I mean, it really was it spawned a lot of different artists that then went and did, a lot of things. And that's where we met a lot of folks. And they hosted us, Theater Gale, a couple of other theaters. There were about 4 of us that we shared residence, because there were 2 or 3 theaters in there. And then things happened, and it was really around 1990 was when I think there was a kind of artistic crisis, and that's a whole other show. So I won't go in. But needless to say, they then forced to redesign. The theater was taken over by, I think it was Midtown Atlanta, but then it was run by the Alliance, and
the Alliance ended up with it eventually.
They ended up with it, but there was an interim hands kind of thing, and it really, I think, it shook the community. That there was a sense that this was an institution that should have been bailed out, that should have been saved, that should have been allowed to continue because of how important and vital they were to the community, and the fact that the powers that be allowed it to fall into bankruptcy it created a kind of fissure, I think, in the community in 1990, because up until that point, I think we were all working in a sense collectively to create Atlanta as a kind of cultural capital, in the South. And it was becoming that, along the Atlanta Newport Project.
For sure,
It really was. The Atlanta Theater Coalition. I mean, there were a lot of things that created a conversation and a synergy around using Atlanta as really creating a kind of, a cultural capital in terms of the South. And I think that did a lot to derail it and diffuse it. I'm not sure it's recovered from that. It may have, but not to the degree. I don't, you always have the sense of nostalgia. Back in my day, there was a sense of, I don't feel that same sense of community and the level of kind of cooperation of all of these theaters and all of these different interests coming together to try and create Atlanta as this really artistic capital. I don't feel that same kind of cooperation and coalition.
There is, I think you're not in the midst of it. There is, but I think what's different is that the film and television industry is such a big competitor that we don't have the footprint. We had such a big footprint in the city back in those days because we didn't have film and television as a competitor. And so we made a bigger difference to the community. But there is a lot of cooperation still going on. We're all talking to each other about what's going on right now, which is great, but we have trouble getting traction in terms of the, just our presence in our communities.
Yeah, well, and some of the signature events I don't remember having, like there were the Piedmont Arts Festival, right, which was always a signature event at the end of the year, everybody's season, which was an amazing, it kind of gathered hundreds of thousands of people over the course of a week. And it was kind of this galvanizing event where you could see film and there were visual arts and there were performing arts and, in terms of free plays and theater companies from around the city were being invited to perform on those stages. And so it gave people an opportunity to see. So, I mean, if you didn't necessarily, come to Jomandi, you could come to Piedmont Park at the end of that. And so we got a lot of traction and a lot of support, and a lot of theaters did, because now there was this galvanizing event where you could showcase your work to hundreds of thousands of people. Yeah. Over the course of the week. There was the Atlanta Dance Festival, which was kind of galvanized to 20 to 30 dance companies around the city and presented this week. There later on there was the the National Black Arts Festival in the late, which was the brainchild of former Commissioner Michael Lomax, who wanted to have what he considered to be a Black Spoleto in Atlanta. So there were all of these kind of signature events that I think helped to galvanize communities that may or may not be receptive or responsive to what you were doing, locally, but that it gave them people an opportunity to come see what you were doing in a larger context. So those kind of signature events I don't see as much of. Because I love the Piedmont Arts Festival. It was great. The Neighborhood Arts Center, where we started, had what they call this African village. So you would go into the village and you would do all kinds of performance, et cetera, et cetera. You would go to the left of the park and you could see theatrical outfit. We could see, kind of what what Horizon does in the summer now at Piedmont, or what, in terms of those. But it was all over the park. So you had this hundreds of thousands of people. And I think they had 2 to 3 million people during the course of a week, from not simply Atlanta, but surrounding counties and the surrounding cities. Those kinds of things, I think, galvanize people in terms of making the arts sustainable and why it becomes important in their own lives. When you can take your family, to sit to an event where for a week you're having this kind of immersive arts experience, it's not a hard sell to come and say why theater is important. It's not a hard sell to say why the arts are important. You've already enrich the lives of people during the course of the weekend, so that you don't have to make the case of why it's important in your community. They experience it organically. Those are some of the events I missed, that National Black Arts Festival, that I think, outside of just the conversation we have with each other as artists and audience in terms of audience engagement, how that begins to speak not only to the region, but also to the rest of the country.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And then so what happened? So Jomandi went for a long time, and then it was time to move on. But what made you know it was time to be done, or what went on in that?
I think I was in the lobby of one of the plays we were doing at 14th Street. And a woman came out and said there was no toilet paper in the restroom. And I spent 45 minutes going around the city trying to find toilet paper. And I was like, I don't think this is why I got into that what became consumptive was just the tedium of having to maintain an institution. And I was getting further and further away from the impulse of why I wanted to be in an artistic institution, which was to do work, which was to create new plays, was to contribute to the landscape, not only of the American theater, but African-American dramatic literature, and, contributing to that landscape. And the further I was getting away from that and having to attend endless board meetings and having to explain the rationale of why we should be doing the work that we were doing. When I sat in a board meeting and 2 or 3 board members decided they wanted to plan the season, that was on the heels of getting toilet paper. I said, okay, this is not the institution we created. I don't need to be here anymore, because this is not why we stated. It's not why we began. We didn't organize around a group of well-intentioned board members wanting to become artistic directors of a theater. And so at that point it became very easy. It was painful, but it became really apparent that your life is orbiting in a different direction, and you need to follow that, and don't stay and fight it, because it was going to be one of 2 things. I was going to stay. It was going to be a power struggle if I stayed, and ultimately my ego tells me we would have won, but at what cost? Yeah. Would we have not created a fissure in the organization that was irreparable? So rather than do that, I wasn't trying to destroy the organization. I really, because I loved it. It was it was family. But to stay and fight that struggle when you didn't feel like all the oars were rowing in the same direction felt self-defeating. So I left with the sense deeply rooted that I knew it wouldn't exist for 2 years after I left. That Marcia and I really were the kind of organizing principle around that, and whatever struggles we had, managerial, et cetera, that we were always able to allow the art to lead us. And it did. It took us from where we were in 1978 to the 3rd largest African-American theater institution in the country. It took us from, the Neighborhood Arts Center, which was then on Georgia Avenue, to around the world in terms of performing. It took us into working with artists internationally renowned all over. It took us to having a reputation for contributing to the landscape of African-American theaters. And a lot of people don't know that when we started, there were 9 to 11 Black theater companies in Atlanta. We were really the low guys on the totem pole. And so part of what it did was we had to find an identity for what we were and who we were relatively quickly, because there wasn't that kind of space. Over the course of 20 some odd years of being there, then, watching the de-evolution of theaters African-American theaters in the city, for whatever the reasons were, going from 11 to then 1, was like we had to kind of really try to hold on to our mission of why we were who we were. It was really easy in the early days. I never forget the founder of Negro Ensemble Company was kind of, a mentoring institution for us. They were huge during my growing up in New York. Every year, the Negro Ensemble Company had some show on Broadway. Whether it was Home or Neva's Mountain Dew or River Niger or Ceremonies and Dark Old Men. I mean, really, they were kind of the institution, the national Black institution that was the standard bearer for what success looked like. And we had honored Douglas Turner Ward, its founder, at one of our signature fundraising events at Jomandi called Legacy. And we were sitting at a bar on 14th Street, oddly enough. And I said, Doug, what was the hardest thing about NEC? He said, as long as we were failing, NEC was fine, because everybody had was moving in the same direction. The thing that killed us was success. The minute you could come to NEC and, get a Broadway show, or, aside from our Broadway show, the minute you could come to NEC and get a television series, then the agenda of artists coming into the theater changed. The trajectory changed. And not many people realize that, NEC is where NEC and New Federal Theater is where Denzel came out of, where Samuel L. Jackson came out of, where Soldier's Play came out of, which later became A Soldier Story. The trajectory of the theater changed for artists once they could come to the theater and yield a kind of personal success that was different than institutional success, providing, creating a landscape for artists, et cetera, et cetera. And he said that was the tension inside the organization that kind of pulled it apart. And I think for us, we experienced, not to the same degree, but similarly, and not so much with artists as much as at some degree with artists, but more so with I think, administrative people and board people who came to kind of bask in a kind of success that they wanted for themselves. And part of that didn't mean contributing in the way that we thought they would. It meant, oh, I want to be on stage kind of thing. I want to pick the plays. I want to do X, Y. And so that struggle was one that I said, you know what? It's not worth the fight. There are bigger fish to fry. There's a bigger fight to have. And who I am as an artist singularly is not someone that is destructive, I don't think, at my core. I think it's I got into running a theater because I wanted to be an institution builder, and I wanted to edify the community that I lived in. And so it felt counterintuitive to kind of stay and fight.
And then, you went on to a life that was really different, because instead of building an institution, you ended up building projects and collaborating with a lot of different companies around the country. What was that transition like for you? And how did you manage that transition, and what were the highlights of that?
I wish I said that there was a kind of blueprint for it. I don't know. I just knew I wanted to work with artists. And so I kind of deconstructed in my own head, the Jomandi model. I said, what is it that I have now going into it was eye-opening, because when you make all these relationships over 20 years. I had been working with, theaters in DC and in LA and in San Diego and Minneapolis and Chicago. And, I was working with a lot of theaters, and, you had these relationships with people. And so when I left, I figured I had the relationship. So I would call these, like, hey, how you doing? I'm free now. I'd love to direct, and da-da. And they were like, oh yeah, okay, I'll get back to you. And I realized that the reason why my calls were being taken was because I was part of this thing called Jomandi, not because I was Tom Jones. And so it was eye-opening. It was like, oh, you talk about ego shattering. You're like, oh, but I'm the same guy. It's like, no, yeah, that's nice. But I'll get back to you. I'll call you, I promise. And when the phone never rings and you're sitting there looking at it going, oh, okay, I'm going to have to become really self-determining in moving forward. But that was the same instinct that I don't think you ever lose that. That was the instinct that drove creating Jomandi. So it was just, how do I invent and reinvent myself? And I realized what I wanted to do is I wanted to work with artists. I wanted to work with writers. I wanted to work with developing new work. That instinct never leaves. So I took 6 months. I took as much money as I had. I liquidated my daughter's college account. because I had I had no money. I had 6 months of unemployment, and I got on a plane and I just traveled around the country. And I would just literally knock on doors and walk into institutions and, say, hey, how are you? I'm a friend of so-and-so and so-and-so, and I'd like to sit down and talk. And I must have talked to about maybe 20, 30 people over the course of that 6 months. And over the next 6 months, then I started just getting calls, but not from institutions, but individual artists that said, you know what, I'm a playwright and I need a play up, but I don't have access. I'm an actor, and I'm how do I get into, working in institutions? It seems so competitive. So what we began to do was really create a smaller production company that worked more one-on-one with individual artists. So the first couple of things we did was actually work the first job I had was actually from a longtime friend who did return my phone call, named Jack Ruler, who runs Mixed Blood in Minneapolis. And
Jack's my mentor. I love Jack.
I love Jack. Our running commentary is, we are brothers from another mother. We both identify. And I met Jack in early 1990s when I was doing my one-man solo show at the Village Gate in New York. And Jack was just in town. He came to see it, and we connected from that point, like 1990, 91, and we've been friends ever since. So he actually called me. I actually called him and said, man, I'm looking for work. And he called me probably a couple of weeks after that, my little sojourn, my 6-month sojourn, and said, hey man, I got a play. You want to come do it? I said, not only, he said, you want to read it? I said, I need a job. No. I trust you. And it happened to be with a couple of writers who were writing their first play. Who were actors I had known. And so it became really easy, in doing that, but it was one of them places that said, okay, this can be a home. And this is, someplace, and this is kind of what I want to do. But the 6-month sojourn turned into calls from individual artists, wanting to have access. So we started working with a lot of young playwrights, older playwrights, composers, etc. And one of the first projects we did, which was, paid the rent for a couple of years, was Body-Snatchers the Musical. with right, which actually
you became kind of like a play doctor, right? Like you would take people's ideas, and you're still doing this. You take people's ideas and you make them theater, sort of.
That's exactly it.
Yeah.
That's exactly it. And that became, aside from it returned me, I think, organically to my first instincts of why I started at theater in the first place. It got me more in touch with the actual hands-on being in a studio and doing work and creating art and making plays, which was far more intriguing and interesting than, again, riding around the city looking for toilet paper, though necessary. It's just not where I saw my life heading. So yeah, it became really, and from that, then other people, oh, well, you're doing it with them. Can you do, And so we then started leveraging these relationships with theaters, because what we were also working with were independent artists who had money, which was oddly enough. So we started working with theaters to say, okay, well, they'll actually give you $50,000 if you just produce their play. And they were like, what? Well, yeah, they have this, the first Body-Snatchers the Musical, the executive, the writer and composer of the piece, his father started a company, a cosmetic company called Levlor, which was the precursor to Revlon. Yeah. He sold his interest. So he was sitting on this big trust fund. We then did it in DC as a workshop. And one of the executive producers came on, had a $1 billion online banking. So I had never been around so much money in my life. I mean, I was like, where are y'all with Jomandi? We could have used you. Why are you showing up now? But if I were with Jomandi, I never would have done Body-Snatchers the Musical. That wouldn't have, it wouldn't have been hard.
No, yeah. Right.
Maybe yes, maybe no. So we started doing that, and then leveraging a lot of other different, projects and working with, and that's pretty much ended up how we did Two Queens, One Castle, which is the first piece we did with Horizon. And you can tell that story about how you found it, but
I told them already.
Did you? Okay. Yeah, my phone got hot and and it dropped. It said, no, you will not be talking today. Tom talks. No, he will not. Tom will not talk is the new title. Tom has nothing to say. But we were doing, I was working with Jack in Minneapolis, and he said, hey man, you want to, I've been working with this amazing kind of artist. and she really is. Her name was Jomandi Steele. She was part of the Steele family, which is infamous not only in Minneapolis but around the country. Lee Brewer, who was known for doing gospel at Colonus that happened on Broadway, created the piece for their family. She was the background singer to Prince for about 5-6 years. It was in a number of his videos. It toured with him. Is kind of she and her brother was the musical director and artistic director of something called Sounds of Blackness, which was, you know, had numerous hits in the 90s. So she's kind of legendary in the Twin Cities as well as around the country. She also was nominated for an Academy Award for a song called it used to be the theme song to an AT&T commercial, Bell South commercial, but it was in Baghdad Cafe, this really, you know, kind of underground indie feature that, you know, had a lot of eyeballs on it. But she had been nominated for an Academy Award for a song she had composed in that her sister actually sang in the movie, or lip synced in the movie, because she actually was a singer for it. So Jomandi had a life experience where she was married to a man who had come out of the closet in the midst of their marriage because he was diagnosed with HIV. And she wanted to tell that story from those who are left behind, and a sense of what it is to kind of reconcile and reconstruct your life after this kind of, you know, catastrophe. So we called it. She had been through another writer, didn't like where it went. Jack put us in the room together. We talked. She laid out, you know what she thought the story was. I came back to her with a story outline. She said, "Yeah, that's I think the story." I sent it to her. She said, "Yeah, this is the musical I want to do." I wrote some of the lyrics. She wrote some of the lyrics to songs that she had. She brought in her brother as a composer. I brought in a composer named William Hubbard, who was kind of known in the gospel world, and they had known each other as well, because William, oddly enough, when they did the show at the Arena years earlier, had been in the chorus, so she knew from that. But William Hubbard also was kind of known. Walter Hawkins and that whole world had recorded a song of his called "I Love the Lord Today," which was kind of internationally known. So there was this kind of nice synergy in the room. We created the piece. We did it at Mixed Blood. The husband threatened to shut down the production, said he was and so Jack, being Jack Ruler of Mixed Blood, said, "Oh, just let me know when, so I can I can call off the cameras." But it got a lot of energy around it. It
got a lot of buzz if I heard about it, you know what I mean?
Yeah, it really did. And so it went really, really, really well. In fact, he and the family came the opening night, and we were like, "Okay, what's going to happen?" And he just sat and cried. And at the end of it, actually walked up to Jomandi and said, "I'm sorry," and walked out with his family. So from all of this thing of thinking he was going to be, kind of crucified, I think, or made a martyr, I think, what the healing power of art is, that you begin to see yourself, in a way and in a context. It gives you sometimes an aesthetic distance and allows you to see what the impulses are in situations that you're, far too engaged. One of our early mantras at Jomandi was an old Amiri Baraka quote, was that you turn their faces to the light and you work on them black magic and cleanse them at having seen the ugliness. And when the beautiful see themselves, they will love themselves. And that was never more demonstrative than in that thing of watching someone see himself, love himself, and then walk away, being able to say, "I'm okay with this," And so at that point, we went on.
Wonderful. Yeah, I think, Tom, I know we are, I can talk forever with people, but what I love about your work as a writer, as a director, you do it all. But in your work,
say that again, Lisa. Go on, say that again.
I know. You got to hear it over and over.
The connection got bad. I didn't hear what you said. What you say?
But what I love about your work as both a writer and director is that you're able to take. You have a lot to say in how you look at the world and what you want to tell people and say, but you have a way of doing it that people want to watch, because you combine comedy, dance, music. You let people get hit in the heart by it. It hits your head, but it hits your heart too, in a way that people can't ignore and are really moved by. And I mean, moved to laugh, moved to cry, moved to whatever. But I think that's what makes your work particularly powerful, is that it's not intellectual and yet it's smart. And I think everybody appreciates that. And that is true both of the work that you create, that you're writing, but also in what we approach in your directing work as well. But I'm curious what, you know, you have
Can I piggyback on that point just a bit? Sure. To that point, years ago, again, I talk about Sonia Sanchez being one of my mentors. You know, I really was a child of the Black arts movement of the 60s and 70s. And one thing I think that Douglas Turner Ward and Ron Milner and Woody King and Sonia and all these icons from that era said is, your politics are your politics inherently. You don't have to keep talking about it. You know, you are going to bring that to whatever you do. So forget about it. Go on then and write the piece or direct the piece or perform the piece in a way that's going to engage the sensibility of the audience that's in front of you. Because if you bore them, if you don't engage them, if you don't entertain them, it doesn't matter what your politics are, they're not listening to it. And I think it was a valuable lesson. Sometimes when I work a lot with young writers, it's again, they want to write the play to save the world. And it's like, forget it. You know, write the play that makes someone interested in it. You have 2 hours of their time. Take them someplace that they want to go that they haven't been before, and they'll stay with you. And whatever it is you want them to heal. We were just finished working, you know, speaking of that, working with a young writer, her first play in Atlanta, Synchronicity, and part of, you know, nobody really wanted to do the play, you know, because they didn't know how to get their hands around it. And it was really, and I really was grateful that I had all these years of working with playwrights and helping them kind of discover their own voices. People helped me find mine. And part of what she's, I want to end racism with the play. And I said, well, forget it. It's not going to happen. So, just it ain't going to happen. Trust me. We tried. Let me show you the list of plays that tried to end racism. Didn't happen. Look around you. So now, once we can get rid of that, know that that is your intent. That's never going to leave. Now let's tell a story that people want to hear. And I, to her credit, she was really, really smart. And her name was Kimberly Monk, and we did it Synchronicity called, it was
Hands of Color.
Hands of Color, thank you. Don't get old, Lisa. Just don't get old.
I'm already there, but I just happened to read it before. Otherwise, I wouldn't have been able to come up with it either.
Right. But part of what I think was successful was that she was smart enough as an actor, as a performer, to say, okay, nothing's too precious. I can let it go if it doesn't work, which is a hard lesson to learn, but also to stop trying to save the world through a play. You know, that's not what a play is going to do. It's never going to save the world. I think the best what theater can do is ask a powerful question. And if we're compelled to answer it, then we change because of it. And then we go and change the circumstances that we observe. Go ahead. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, I don't think I was doing it. You just keep going. Be fine. The thing I was going to ask was, so I'm also curious. I know you've talked to me about your influences, like the various things that influence. I know comics have been an influence. Music is such a big part of your directing, certainly. You want to talk a little bit about those influences?
Yeah, I think somewhere in about the middle 80s, I got bored with theater, with the quote unquote the well-made play, you know, the 4 chairs and a table. Not that they weren't valuable, but just, you know, we'd been working in a lot of different styles and a lot of different vocabularies. And at some point in time, I just got, as performance, I was finding I was going to the theater and I wasn't being pulled in a way that I was being pulled in. I would go to stand-up comics and there was this immediate kind of visceral response I had to it, with one guy or one woman in front of a microphone saying, I got 5 minutes to get you, you know, if that. If I don't get you in the first 2 minutes, I'm done.
That's,
you know, this
for sure.
The evening's not going to end well. And watching comic after comic after comic. I was going to a lot of jazz clubs and music clubs, and almost the same thing. What is the difference between the artist that was able to make you stop drinking, you know, the tinkling of glasses, at that point you could smoke in buildings, smoking cigarettes, and having your private conversation, stop that and go to the stage. And those that really, and all of it seemed to have, you know, this kind of common thread, which was, I've got to get you immediately. And once I have you, I have to make sure that I'm doing something that keeps you going. And those that were craftsperson in that, the difference between a comic who had a couple of good jokes and the comic who could create a set that made you follow them from the beginning to the end, all of them had really similar kind of, and I wanted to bring that element into the theater. You know, I wanted to have that kind of gestalt, that visceral, I'm going to get you in the first 5 minutes and I'm never letting you go. You know, to treat your audience as if everybody has ADHD, you know, that, you know, they have something else to do other than watch it there. So that, I think, was at the heart of trying to define a style, a signature moving in a way that that something that happened in dance and in music was that there was this kind of fluidity. There was something that was fluid about it. It never stopped. It never said, and the best of it never let you know it was coming. That there was always this kind of sense it moved like a river. And so I wanted to try and create those kinds of experience, that kind of style of performing, that kind of style of directing, that style of writing, where you were constant, where transitions from moment to moment were seamless, where you never knew what was. And because watching the best comics or the best musicians, that's what happened. They would go and they were always telling a story. And it wasn't like they were going at you. They were just creating something that made you listen, some little thing that stopped. And then once they had you, they knew where to take you. And you could see the difference between a comic or a musician who had that, knew how to do it, and could take you on the journey, and those who would get you and then lose you, or those who could never get you at all. And so that was, I think, the genesis for me for my one-man show called Wizard of Hip, which was trying to move one at light speed, which it did. I remember when I went to New York, they said, one of the first producers said, I never thought I'd find anybody who could talk or had as much energy as Charles Dutton, but you do.
You had a lot. You talked really fast, had a lot. You still do, but not like you were when you were that age, man.
No, that was a different kind of
fire.
Yeah, it was, but it came immediately from that, that Richard Pryor, Robin Williams, George Carlin, Bill Cosby to some extent, this sense of storytellers with a mic sitting there engaging you. And each of them, even though they didn't stylistically weren't the same, I always remember the story of Richard Pryor saying when he first broke into stand-up comedy, he wanted to be Bill Cosby. And it took him years to not be. And he actually took 2 years off at the height of his popularity and left and said, I've got to go back and tell my stories. So he went back home and he told the stories of his grandmother raising him in a brothel, of the people he knew coming in and out, of his father, that he in a sense said, I'm going to tap into the very pain that that created comedy for me in the first place, and I'm going to tell that story. Ultimately it consumed him, but that is also what made him this kind of superstar, of hearing somebody say, wow, we've never heard somebody talk like this, but it was that sense of, I've got to find my own voice, and I got to find my own stories in my own stories. And, I know I'm good as a comedian. Now, what is it that I want to say? And so I think by the mid to late 80s, I had enough belief in us that I know that I think I'm good as a theater artist, but what do I want to say? At this point in my life, in a way that's from a performing point that has this kind of unique, that has this gestalt. Don't bore the people who come to see you.
So I'm going to segue because I'm to tell the audience, I know we've been at this for a while, and I'm going to go maybe another 5 minutes or so, but this is the start of Tom's series. He's going to talk every week, we think.
I don't know, that may have been the kiss of death right there.
But the talk with we'll have other people that he interviews and get.
Thank you. Yes, absolutely.
not you by yourself, although you could probably handle it for about 5 seconds. We're only partway into your career, but I wanted to jump a little bit forward and say, so you said, what do I want to say? So there's a lot going on in the world right now.
Yeah, there is.
What do you want to say now? What are you drawn to? What are you thinking about?
What's that old adage about the more things change, the more they stay the same? It's like live long enough and you'll begin to see history repeat itself in a certain way. I think probably want to create a venue where young artists can say what's on their mind, but say it in a way that it's and I have this conversation with my daughter all the time. It doesn't matter what you have to say if you can't say it well, and that ultimately you will have to do for this generation what we tried to do with our generation, with those who came before us, was be the conscience of a nation, was be the place where healing can happen, was be the place where in your theaters you can create a context and a conversation that people can have, because at least it's civilized. And there are people, particularly if you can get disparate points of view of people sitting in an audience, they get to all engage in a public conversation, a public discourse that's not about screaming, that's about talking, listening, and healing. And I don't think that charge and that mission changes at all. I just think the artists who are engaged in it are doing it, and that they have to become really inventive in terms of how it is that they're going to engage audiences. Also, how can we use these technologies and the technologies that are available to us to deal with audience engagement in a way that's not just simply the traditional, as we were coming up with, having a ramp so that someone in a wheelchair can come to the theater. What does audience engagement look like in 2020? Where are we in terms of disparate populations of people who may be shut in? How do we begin to allow theater to speak to them? How do we begin to use the technologies to put it in their living room? How do we create immersive, interactive experiences? How do you begin to write using the technologies? How do you, look, all of those kinds of questions for a young artist, I think, is what's going to begin, getting them to, to heal the world. I think when I was watching yesterday, the sense of this, civil disturbance and this unrest and this, going in the streets, what I think was different from, work on a piece called For Peace I Rise, which is a musical on the life of C.T. Vivian, who was Martin Luther King Jr.'s lieutenant, and helped organize the Southern strategies for protest, in the South. And I'll never forget something sitting in his living room. I said, what would you do if you hadn't been with Martin King? What would your life have turned? He said, no, I always knew I wanted to improve the quality of life for Black people. What I didn't have was a strategy. And when I discovered King and nonviolent direct confrontation, I realized there was an answer that I hadn't answered. And so part of what watching yesterday is that I understand the nature of insurrection and rebellion. You just don't have an answer. And I think what the theaters can be is it's a place where we create solutions, where we create a conversation where, because we've had mass movements before, we've had people who have been upset. Like I said, there's no one play that's cured racism. So the issues of race and sex and gender, et cetera, have been with us for a long time. The difference is very often there was a leadership that coalesced around this foment, around this anger, that then said, we can direct it. We can push it someplace. We can find what the appropriate target is. We can develop the appropriate strategies that begin to not, are you really, I understand your anger, but is, putting a curse word on CNN logo, is that going to accomplish your agenda? Probably not.
Well,
I understand the need to say it.
Has to emerge, that's where at the opening of this thing where something has to emerge, a leader.
Exactly. And so the difference, I guess, in terms of that, of saying, watching leadership emerge around this discontent and place it somewhere also informed the theaters, that the theaters recognized of those, the Free Southern Theaters, the NECs, the New Federal Theaters, the Jomandis, the Horizons, the Theatrical. We emerged out of a culture of saying theater has to engage audiences in a community to answer some of the questions that are being raised in the larger culture. That there's not this disassociation between what's happening in the world and what's happening in our theaters, and that in many instances we were an artistic engine advancing those conversations. And I think in this time, in 2020, where the fissures are becoming much more obvious, where we're beginning to see, what the social and political and economic inequalities are, where all the things that are particularly in these, what we call a pandemic. There was a pandemic before there was a pandemic, and so all this did was exacerbate the existing issues. What can theater do in that context to help fix, heal? And I think it can do what it did 20, 30 years ago, become, in a sense, a place where aggregate civilized human beings can sit and look and talk and debate and reason and disagree without killing each other. Yeah. So that I think is the overall.
This is why you and I get along, because I'm all about how does the play move us forward? What is the story we're going to tell? This we know the problems. God knows we've been on this planet for a long time, and the problems are there. We don't have to belabor that, but how the heck are we going to get out of it?
Right. And giving voice to the voiceless. What King said years ago. A riot is simply is the voice of the unheard. And so, how then do we create means by which they can be heard? And so that's what I guess I talk to my daughter about. I talk to artists, to engage in that, to not shy away from that struggle, but to do the hard work of asking hard questions. And if we are truthful enough, we'll sit, as uncomfortable as it may make us feel. We will sit, if we really care about healing, we'll sit and do it. Because healing is not a process that happens without pain. you know, and so we have to be willing to commit to all that it takes to kind of hear our culture.
Well, this has really been a great conversation, and I learned things that I didn't know yet. So we haven't figured out who Tom's guests are going to be coming up. So if you have suggestions, you can, you know, somebody, there's that feedback at horizontheater.com. That goes to like everybody at Horizon. That goes to me and everybody else. So if you send anything to feedback at horizontheater.com, we'll all read it. Anything you want to say about what you heard today, suggestions you have for anybody you'd like Tom to talk to. We were talking about who else he might talk to or what he might talk about. And I'm sure that will be coming up. And hopefully next project is, well, we were supposed to do The House That Will Not Stand by Marcus Gardley this summer. And of course, we're not producing that this summer, but we will be producing it next summer. And Tom was not going to be able to direct it this summer, but he is going to be able to direct it.
Yes, I am. I am really happy about that. I love that play and I love that writer. Let me say thank you, Lisa, for hooking this up, for making this happen. I appreciate you so much. A little
technical difficulty, but we
That's all right. Yeah. Rename it Tom and Will Not Talk.
Or Tom will talk and talk and talk, but that's
right. And so, just as a thing of the ending of every Tom Talks, we're going to toast.
All right.
And toast to all those who are there for in future. You know, have a glass up to all those who are working on our behalf to keep us healthy and strong and safe. Each week we will toast to you and everybody else and anybody else you may want to toast to. So thank you. My toast this week is to you, Lisa, for opening this up and allowing us this to happen.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Here.
All right. And that's the end.
Take me close.